He came back to a quiet town, expecting distance, but not the kind that greeted him. A daughter's teddy bear abandoned on the porch, its stitches frayed like his nerves. The house stood mute, its walls swallowing the echo of laughter, leaving only the scent of burnt coffee and a letter on the counter, its ink smudged with regret. Wars overseas have an end. The ones at home lie in wait, ready to detonate with a single knock. The bus sighed to a stop as if it had carried the season on its back. Doors folded open. A strip of late autumn light lay across the platform, thin as ribbon, and the trees behind the ticket shack rattled their bare hands together as the wind moved through them. He paused by the painted line, feeling for a moment like a man who had missed the last step in the dark, heart catching, breath short, though nothing around him moved fast enough to earn panic. He'd been gone long enough for the town to forget his gate. The cracked soda machine, the notice board with its curling flyers for church suppers and yard sales, the gum-scarred bench under the eaves, all where they had always been, but smaller now, as if years had leaned in and pressed their thumbs against the world. Ethan adjusted the strap on his shoulder and started down the sidewalk toward Front Street, boots measuring the distance in quiet jolts that rose up his spine and settled behind the heart. He did not think of himself as a man in uniform. The fabric had softened to a civilian shyness, the creases no longer cut like authority. He walked with that careful economy soldiers keep long after they come home, the way you carry a pot of water filled to its lip across an uneven floor. In the windows he passed, he caught reflections of his own outline, the slope of his shoulders, a gray thread at the temple, the squint born from desert brightness that never left. He looked less like a hero than a neighbor who had once carried something heavy and set it down out of sight. Front Street had traded noise for weather. An empty flatbed sat at the curb with rain pooled in the ribbed steel, the puddle holding the sky like a promise no one could collect. The drugstore's bell did not jingle. A display of wool caps leaned at a weary angle in the outfitter's window. When a gust came, it combed the loose leaves into the gutter and kept going. Ethan found himself counting sounds. Hail, too. Wind in the birches. The faint tick at his wrist. He had worn the same watch through 2 tours and into the long in-between. He reached the corner where the diner used to breathe out its buttered air, but the windows were dark, and the paper menu taped to the door had curled at all 4 corners. He remembered putting it there with a hammer that bit his skin when he missed. A dog barked once behind a fence, then remembered him the way dogs remember steady men, and settled into a low whine that sounded almost like apology. Across the road, the field lay open to the horizon, stubble shining with that brief metallic light that makes even a used-up land seem new. He should have felt his chest loosen as the familiar arranged itself around him, but the loosening did not come. Instead, the old ache, small, persistent, of a man who has learned to walk around his own life as if it were sleeping and might wake ruined. He pictured Maddie's face as he remembered it. Rounder, a front tooth missing, eyes that took all of him in and did not blink. He did not picture the present version. He let the years fog that glass for one more block. He stopped outside the chain link that trimmed the yard like a hard line drawn by a tired hand. The gate creaked, a human sound in a world that had forgotten most of its voices. The porch boards held their grain like a map of places he had never arrived. On the step sat a milk crate turned upside down, the white plastic squared with dirt, as if someone had been using it for a chair. Beside it, a chalk drawing had survived 2 light rains. A crooked sun, a stick figure with a triangle dress, a smaller figure holding a lopsided balloon. He drew his boot back from the drawing like he might disturb an altar. At the threshold, he paused again, fingers on the knob, palm remembering 100 small rotations that had opened rooms to him. The brim of his cap throwing a short, soft shadow on the door. He listened. Behind the wood, only the breath of the house, the give of joists, the secret hum of a refrigerator motor somewhere. The long, careful exhale heat makes when it slips into spaces it hasn't filled in a while. He set the pack down, not with relief, but with the caution you use for something that might leak. The zipper snagged, and he let it, hands falling to his sides. A sparrow skittered along the gutter above him and hopped to the downspout, peering over with that bird impatience that makes you feel measured by a thing too light to hold judgment. He smiled without teeth, and it passed. The key was in his pocket where he left it before the last bus, the last plane, the last convoy. He slid it into the lock, turned. The click felt like a sentence closing on itself. Inside, the air belonged to another year. He stood in the doorway long enough for his eyes to make sense of the dim. The couch wore its sag in the same place. The blanket his mother had knit when the world still called him boy lay folded and faded across the arm. On the end table, a glass with a ring of dust, a coaster with a water stain darker than memory. He did not call out. There are names that must not be spoken to the empty, else the echo they bring back breaks a thing you can't fix. He stepped out of his boots. The floor gave a mild complaint, and then accepted him the way earth accepts a shovel, with resignation and a kind of hospitality. He crossed the window and drew 2 fingers down the curtain edge. Light slid in, narrow, pale, undecided, and laid itself across the rug like a promise written small, so small a man could step over it and never know he had. From the kitchen came the quiet thrum of a clock, not the cheerful shape of time, but its stubbornness. He stood in the doorway and took in the room, a bowl turned upside down to dry, the shallow shine of a wiped counter, a yellow note taped to the side of the fridge with nothing written on it. He placed his hand against the refrigerator door and felt the low animal warmth of its running. He closed his eyes and let the hum replace thought until the hum began to sound like distance. Outside, wind pulled at the birch leaves, and they ticked against one another like coins. He did not turn to the hallway yet. He pressed his fingers flat on the table, spread them wide, as if measuring the span between then and now. In his pocket, the watch ticked, and the sound, so small and faithful, made the room feel less abandoned. He breathed through his nose until the air stopped smelling like a place that had been waiting and began to smell like a place that might, with the ordinary mercies, warm water, a trimmed wick. A door left ajar, become a home again. He opened his eyes. Somewhere down the hall, a hinge made a tired sound. He did not move toward it. Instead, he reached for the chipped mug at the sink, turned the tap, and let the water run until the metal stilled its shiver. He filled the cup, drank, and set it back upside down where it had been, a small ritual to tell the house he would be gentle. Then, and only then, he lifted his pack, slipped the strap over his shoulder, and walked quietly toward the dim where the hallway began, where the air changed, where a man practiced the oldest bravery there is, coming back to what needs him without being certain he still knows how. The wind chased him down the block, curling around the corners of houses until it reached the narrow side street he hadn't walked in over a decade. The pavement here was uneven, patched in small squares like a quilt of someone's half-hearted repairs. Birch leaves, damp and matted, clung to the edges. He slowed without meaning to. Boots catching on a memory before the eye could name it. The side street ended in a squat brick building divided into small, tired apartments. Once, he'd known a couple who lived in the corner unit. The smell of fresh bread always in their hall, a bicycle chained to the railing no matter the season. That was gone now. The hallway he stepped into smelled faintly of old paint and winter air slipping through seams in the walls. Light came from a single bulb overhead, throwing long shadows down the narrow hall. He had meant to keep moving, to pass through without incident, but halfway down he stopped. The sound reached him first, not quite footsteps, not quite the creak of floorboards, but a small shift of weight, cautious like someone measuring the distance between safety and exposure. Ethan turned his head. At the far end, near a battered green door with chipped paint, a girl stood. 10 years old, maybe less, the crown of her head just above the brass doorknob. Her hair was a shade lighter than the wood around the frame, tied back in a hurried knot, strands escaping like fine wire in the light. She wore a sweater too big for her shoulders. The sleeves pushed up unevenly and held a tray, plastic, divided into sections, balanced on both palms. Steam curled from the plate at the center, rising and fading into the cold hall air. When she straightened, she didn't leave. She stepped back 3 measured paces and stood still, hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed on the door. The way she looked at it, it wasn't the way children wait for someone to open up and smile. It was the way a lookout waits, tense and quiet, for a sign no one else would notice. Ethan stayed in place, watching. The air between them held the brittle balance of glass. She hadn't seen him yet. He could have spoken, but something about her stillness pinned his voice. The green door didn't move. No sound came from behind it. After a moment, the girl's shoulders dropped, not in relief, but in acceptance. She knelt again, adjusted the tray so it sat squarely on the mat, and reached into her pocket. From the pocket came a folded napkin, its corners creased so sharply it could have been ironed. She set it beside the plate. The gesture was simple, almost domestic. Steady, held his for a fraction too long, as though she were matching him to something she'd been told. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just blinked once, then turned her head back to the green door as if the sight of him had been folded into the day's ordinary dangers. The bulb overhead flickered. Ethan shifted his weight, feeling the small sting in his knee that cold weather always brought. He thought of saying hello, asking if she needed help, but some instinct kept him quiet. He recognized the discipline in her posture, the kind that comes when a person learns early that speaking without purpose can cost more than it gives. A sound from the stairwell broke the moment. Someone's boots on the steps, a man humming tunelessly. The girl stepped aside, letting the hum pass, and pressed herself lightly to the wall. When the man, middle-aged, carrying a bag of groceries, passed them without a glance, she relaxed enough to breathe out, though she never took her eyes off the door. Ethan took a small step forward, the way you do when words might not be welcome. She didn't return it, but neither did she turn away. From somewhere deep inside the green door came a sound, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. The faint shift of a board under weight, or perhaps the rustle of fabric. The girl straightened, every line in her frame alert again. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She simply waited. In that instant, Ethan saw something that gripped him harder than any battlefield memory, an understanding that this ritual had played out many times before, that whatever lay behind that door held her attention the way an unhealed wound holds a soldier's hand. He didn't need to know the reason to recognize the gravity. The hallway seemed narrower now, the air colder. He glanced at the tray, steam still curling, food untouched, and then back to her. Her gaze remained fixed forward, but a muscle twitched at her jaw, the smallest betrayal of strain. He stood there a moment longer, feeling the quiet turn heavy in his chest. Then, without a word, he moved on down the hall toward the stairs that would take him outside. As he passed the last corner, he looked back once. She was still there, still watching that door like it might open, or like it never should. The street met him with a gust sharp enough to water his eyes. He didn't wipe them. Instead, he took the long way home, his mind turning over the image of the green door, the steam curling into the dim, and the girl who stood guard in silence. The walk from that narrow hall to the worn front steps of the house felt shorter than he remembered, though it had been years since Ethan had last stood here. The street's slope brought him eye level with the second-floor windows, their curtains drawn in a way that suggested habit rather than momentary privacy. A few shingles had loosened near the roofline. The paint on the porch rails had peeled into thin curls, catching in the faint autumn breeze. The key Rachel had mailed to him weeks before sat in his pocket, wrapped in a strip of paper with her careful handwriting, in case he stopped by. He didn't recall promising that he would. Yet here he was. The door resisted at first, the frame swollen by seasons of damp and heat. When it gave, the smell met him all at once. Old wood, faintly sweet with dust, and something else under it. Deliberate and unhurried. He followed it, boots making a low thud against the boards that dipped slightly under his weight. Rachel stood at the counter with her back to him, slicing a red apple into thin, perfect arcs. The knife tapped the wooden board with a practiced gentleness. Each slice nudged into a neat row. She wore a cardigan buttoned high at the neck, her hair pinned in a style he remembered from years ago. For a moment, it was as if the time between his last departure and now had folded in on itself, until she turned. Her eyes flickered with recognition, followed quickly by something less easy to name. The lines around them were deeper, the corners of her mouth slower to curve. "Ethan," she said, the grass brittle from the first frost. A single clothesline sagged under the weight of 2 towels left to dry in the weak sun. Rachel set the knife down, wiped her hands on a folded dish towel. She replied. The words were clipped, practical. Her gaze moved to the teapot on the stove. "She's grown. You'll see." The conversation faltered there, hovering between them like a draft neither could locate. Ethan's attention snagged on a framed photograph on the far wall, Maddie at perhaps 7 years old, standing by a Christmas tree whose lights blurred in the background. She wore the same uncertain half-smile her mother once had when cameras turned her way. He cleared his throat. "On my way in, I passed the in-hall. Green door. Didn't know anyone lived back there." Rachel's eyes didn't move from the kettle she was filling at the sink. You've been away a long time. Things change. Her voice was even, but there was a pause before she set the kettle down, the hollow ring of it on the stove a little sharper than necessary. The steam began to curl from the spout, faint at first. Rachel leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes on the kettle as though willing it to boil faster. Ethan let the question settle back into silence. He'd learned in other places, under different dangers, that pressing too soon rarely got the truth he needed. Sometimes it only made the truth retreat deeper into its hiding place. From somewhere in the house came a faint creak, the sound of weight on a step, or the subtle shift of wood cooling in the evening air. Rachel didn't react. She poured the tea into two mismatched mugs, set one before him without meeting his eye, and took the seat opposite. They drank without speaking for a time. The tea was too hot, but the heat was welcome after the walk. Outside, the sound drew a line under the moment, and he realized he'd been holding his breath without knowing why. The steam from the mugs thinned into the cool air between them, the ceramic warm against his palm, the rising scent of tea cutting faintly through the heavier smell of wood and dust. Outside, the wind pushed against the side of the house, making the eaves whisper. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once sharp, then fell quiet. The room seemed to fold in on itself with each second, the edges softening until there was only the table, the two mugs. Her gaze flicked toward the hallway that led to the front door, as if she could see through the walls to the bus stop where he had stood just an hour ago. "You didn't say you were coming?" She murmured, not accusing, not exactly surprised. "I wasn't sure until I was already on the road," he replied. "The truth, or enough of it." Silence drifted back in, settling heavy like snow. Ethan's eyes found the framed photographs along the far wall, Maddie at different ages, some with Rachel beside her, some with the absent space where her mother's arm should have been. She said, "You'll see her at dinner." He nodded, then glanced toward the hallway that led deeper into the house. "Into the hall," he began, but she cut in quickly. "It's just storage now." The words were smooth, too smooth. She lifted her mug again, the movement almost too deliberate, as if the tea could shield her from further questions. Ethan let the answer sit there. The kettle on the stove ticked softly as it cooled. Somewhere behind the walls, the faint hum of the refrigerator filled the space left by their silence. He shifted again, but not unkindly. "She's family," she said simply, as if that explained everything. They let that be the last exchange for a while. The air between them felt layered, old familiarity on top, something murkier beneath. Ethan drank the last of his tea, the bitterness catching at the back of his tongue, and set the mug down gently. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement through the narrow opening to the living room. A shadow passing, quick and silent. He didn't turn his head. Sometimes a shadow told you more if you didn't chase it. Rachel stood, gathering the empty mugs. "I'll check the roast," she said, her voice returning to the practical register she seemed most comfortable with. She moved toward the counter, her back to him again. Ethan rose too, letting his hand brush the edge of the table. His gaze drifted toward the hall one last time before he stepped into the living room. The floorboards there gave a different sound underfoot, a hollow note that seemed to echo longer than it should. Behind him, the clink of utensils on ceramic carried faintly from the kitchen. The ordinary domestic sounds might have been comforting once. Now, they felt like part of a stage set, convincing at a glance, but fragile if you pressed too hard. He stopped by the bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of a few worn paperbacks. A thin layer of dust clung to them, disturbed only here and there, as if someone had touched certain titles recently and left the rest of the time. When Rachel returned to say dinner was nearly ready, her tone was light again, her smile small and polite. Ethan matched it with a nod, and neither mentioned the green door at the end of the hall. Not yet. The living room felt different once Rachel's footsteps faded back toward the kitchen. It was not entirely empty. No room in a lived-in house ever was, but it seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see what Ethan would do next. He stood still for a moment, letting his ears take in the small, separate strands of sound. The wall clock in the hallway ticked in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each beat leaving a longer pause than it should. Somewhere, in the crawl space under the roof, a rafter shifted with a soft groan. He stepped farther inside, boots making the faintest scuff on the old hardwood. The floor was worn to a dull sheen in the spots where people passed most often, but here in the center of the room, the grain looked untouched, as if no one had lingered there for years. The air had a coolness that didn't match the weather outside, edged with a faint, sweet rot of old wood and something else, something like fabric stored too long. The curtains were drawn almost all the way, but the late autumn sun still found its way through a narrow gap, casting a thin column of light that landed squarely on the arm of the couch. Dust drifted lazily in that beam, each particle visible only for a heartbeat before vanishing into shadow. Ethan's gaze followed one speck until it disappeared, leaving him with the strange impression that the house itself was showing him how slowly time could move. He wandered toward the far wall, where a low bookcase sat between two mismatched chairs. A few of the books leaned awkwardly, their spines faded from sun long gone. A photograph in a frame, without glass, lay face down on the shelf. Reaching for the string, the image was warm but distant, like a memory stolen from someone else's mind. A sudden draft touched the back of his neck, cool enough to raise the hairs there. He turned toward the source and noticed a sliver of space at the bottom of the front door, where the seal had long since worn away. Through it came the low, steady sound of the wind outside. It was not the sharp gusts of a storm, but a quieter push and pull, almost like breathing. It slipped through the house and found its way into the hallway, whispering along the baseboards before disappearing again. Ethan's eyes settled on the hallway itself. It stretched in a straight line from the living room, narrow and shadowed. The tap of Rachel's knife against the cutting board, the quiet clink of ceramic, all of it layered under the steady tick of the clock, which grew louder the longer he listened. He realized it wasn't so much ticking as marking the silence, slicing it into neat, manageable pieces. One chain twisted so the seat hung crooked. He thought of Maddie, small hands gripping those chains, feet kicking against the air, when he let the curtain fall back into place. The house seemed to close in again. It wasn't oppressive, not exactly, more like a body protecting a wound, keeping it hidden, keeping it still. Ethan breathed in through his nose, slow and measured, catching the scent of the old varnish on the woodwork. It was the kind of smell you didn't notice unless you'd been away for years. He took another step toward the hallway, but stopped halfway. There was no reason to go down there yet, not with Rachel, just a few rooms away. Instead, he sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows on his knees, and let the quiet of the house work its way into him. He thought of all the nights he'd spent in places that were not his own, barracks, tents, borrowed quarters, each with its own version of silence. This one was different. This one felt personal, like it knew his name. From somewhere deep in the structure, a single board popped, the sound sharp in the otherwise muffled air. It faded into the faint hum of the refrigerator, which he now realized had been running the whole time like a low note in the background of a song. He leaned back slowly, eyes on the ceiling, and wondered if the house would sound the same once night fell. The air in the house held a weight that was hard to name, and as Ethan lingered in the living room, that weight began to press against the edges of his memory. It was not oppressive in the way a dangerous place feels, but it had the same stillness, an awareness that every sound meant something. He rose from the couch and let his hand trail along the edge of the wall as he moved toward the hallway, the paint beneath his fingertips cold despite the faint warmth of the day outside. It reminded him of certain structures he'd stepped into overseas. Villages left behind when the fighting moved on. Homes where the air inside was a different temperature than the world outside, where dust hung in the light, and every object was a clue about the life that had been lived there. This house didn't have the jagged edges of a war zone, but it had its own kind of abandonment, quiet and slow, the kind that crept in without anyone noticing. He paused in the threshold between the hallway and the dining room, then left in suspension. The thin curtain at the far end of the hall stirred, though there was no open window he could see. The movement was subtle, more a ripple in the dimness than anything else, but it caught his attention the way a shadow sometimes catches a soldier's. He didn't go toward it. Not yet. Instead, he let his eyes wander over the photos lining the hallway wall. Most were crooked, their frames gathering a fringe of dust along the top edge. One showed Maddie in a paper crown. The faces in it were strangers, but someone had kept it safe through months of chaos, long enough for it to end up in that ruin. He'd slipped it into his pack. carried it for weeks before finally tucking it into a supply drop for safekeeping. The thought hit him now. Even in places where nothing was safe, people still kept small things. He turned away and stepped back toward the living room, not wanting to give Rachel any reason to think he was prying. His boots found a patch of floor that creaked sharply, and the sound felt out of place, almost like a cough in the middle of a church service. For a moment, he stood still, listening. No one came. The kitchen noises, knife tapping, cupboard doors, continued as before. From the couch, he could see the corner where Maddie's school bag leaned against the wall. A pair of worn sneakers sat beside it, one lace trailing across the rug. He imagined her feet in those shoes, small and quick, carrying her down the block to school, across the yard to play, maybe even down this hallway toward that closed door. The thought made his stomach tighten. He lowered himself into the chair nearest the window, the upholstery sagging under his weight. Outside, a single leaf skated across the yard, catching against the base of the swing set. He thought again of those other empty places, of wind moving through shattered windows, of laundry lines still strung between poles though no one came to collect the clothes. In those moments overseas, he'd felt a strange pull, the sense that the building was watching him, not the other way around. Now here, in this quiet house, that sensation returned. The clock's ticking was louder now, or perhaps he was just more aware of it. Each talk slid into the next without hurry, without pause. In the spaces between, he could almost hear the house breathe. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the sounds arrange themselves in his mind. Rachel in the kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the wind against the siding. And under it all, a stillness that felt less like peace and more like something waiting. When he opened his eyes again, the beam of sunlight in the room had shifted. Thus still moved in it, but slower now, as if weighed down. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Maddie felt this same weight when she was alone here, and whether she had learned to ignore it or had simply adapted to living inside it. That question, like the rest, would have to wait. For now, he let the house hold its silence, and he held his. The late afternoon light had shifted again, moving across the living room in a long, slow blade that caught the edge of the coffee table and stretched toward Ethan's boots. It was the kind of light that felt thin, like it had traveled too far to be warm, and it made the dust motes look heavy, almost deliberate in their floating. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let his gaze follow that line of sun until it stopped at the far wall. Something about it tugged at him. The angle, maybe, or the way it fell just shy of the hallway entrance, as if it had been stopped on purpose. He tried to push the thought aside, but the image came anyway, a different beam of light, years earlier, spilling through the kitchen of this same house on a late summer day. Maddie had been 5 then, wearing a yellow dress that flared out when she twirled, her small feet bare against the linoleum. He could hear it even now, the soft slap of her heels as she spun in place, giggling, clutching the hem of her dress in one hand and a battered stuffed rabbit in the other. He'd been home for only 2 weeks between deployments, long enough to relearn the sound of her laughter, but not long enough to stop fearing he'd forget again. The memory widened. He saw himself crouched by the sink, rinsing a chipped plate while Maddie talked about something he couldn't quite follow, something about clouds shaped like animals. She'd been fearless in those days, eager to share every passing thought, every small discovery. Her voice had been like a rope pulling him out of the shadows he carried from overseas. Now, sitting here, the quiet pressed harder. The house had the same walls, the same worn edges, but Maddie's voice wasn't spilling into the air anymore. He realized with a pang that he hadn't heard her chatter like that since he'd walked in yesterday. Her words came now in measured drops, carefully placed, as though she were holding something back. He rose from the chair and wandered to the window. Outside, the swing set stood still, chain slack, the seat tipped slightly forward as if someone had just stepped away. That image, an absence with shape, reminded him of another place, another absence. In a village in the mountains of a far-off country. He had once walked through a courtyard where a child's tricycle lay on its side, one wheel still spinning slowly. No voices, no laughter, just the faint creak of the wheel as it slowed. The soldiers with him had kept moving, but he'd paused, watching until the wheel stopped completely. He'd never told anyone about that moment, but it stayed with him, a quiet echo that found him again now. Behind him, a floorboard groaned softly. He turned to see Maddie, standing at the edge of the hallway, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater. She didn't speak. Her gaze drifted toward the closed green door at the far end of the hall, then back to him. It was quick, just a flick of her eyes, but it was enough to make his stomach tighten. He gave her a small smile, the kind meant to say, "It's okay. I'm here." She didn't return it, but she stepped into the living room and sat cross-legged on the rug, picking at a loose thread. The light from the window fell across her hair, catching on strands that hadn't been brushed out completely. For a long minute, they sat like that, him standing, her on the rug, the house breathing around them. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Ethan's eyes went again to the hallway, to that strip of shadow where the green door waited. The memory of Maddie twirling in her yellow dress pressed harder now, almost intrusive in its warmth. It was as if the house was showing him what had been here once, so that he could better feel the gap. And he did feel it, like standing in a room where someone had just left. The rise and fall of her shoulders small and careful. He wanted to ask about the door, about what she'd been looking at, but the words caught. The silence between them was not empty. It was a container holding something fragile. Breaking it too soon would spill everything before he was ready to catch it. So he let the light fade a little more. Let the dust settle slower in the air. He stayed still, as he had in other rooms halfway across the world, waiting for the right sound, the right movement to tell him when to act. In the corner of his mind, the memory of the yellow dress and the stuffed rabbit kept spinning, a bright reel against the muted colors of the present. It was a reminder that once, this house had been filled with the small, fearless noises of a child who didn't yet know how to hold things back. He wondered how long it had been since Maddie had felt that way, and whether it was still possible to bring it back. The sun had slid lower, slipping behind the taller houses at the end of the street, and the living room dimmed into a soft gray. Ethan stayed where he was, feeling the edges of the day blur. The house had a way of holding on to shadows, keeping them long after they should have thinned. He could hear Rachel in the kitchen now, the steady rhythm of a knife on a cutting board. It wasn't rushed, but it wasn't leisurely either. The sound carried a strange precision, like she was cutting through more than vegetables. Maddie had drifted down the hall, but her footsteps were light, almost too light to track. Ethan stood, his knees giving a faint pop, and stepped into the hallway. The air felt cooler here, the floor beneath his boots colder. On the left, the green door stood quiet, the chipped paint catching what little light reached it. He paused, letting his eyes trace the scuffs near the bottom, the faint dent in the wood a little higher up. He thought again of the places he'd seen where a door meant safety, and other places where a door meant someone was on the wrong side of it. This one, he wasn't sure yet. But the air here carried a stillness that didn't belong to the rest of the house. It was the kind of stillness he recognized from deserted outposts, where the silence was less about peace and more about something being absent that should be there. A soft creak came from behind him. Maddie had reappeared, standing halfway between him and the kitchen. She was holding a glass of water, both hands wrapped around it. Her eyes slid past him toward the door, just for a heartbeat, before she looked down at the floor. Ethan didn't speak. Instead, he moved past the door and into the small bedroom at the end of the hall, his old room once, though it felt foreign now. The bed was made, but unused, the dresser bare except for a stack of folded towels. Through the window, he could see the street light at the corner flickering to life, buzzing faintly in the cooling air. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the years settle. The gap between him and Maddie was not just the time he'd been away. It was all the quiet spaces that had grown between their days. The birthdays he'd missed, the stories she'd told to someone else, the moments that had no place to return to. In the war, he'd learned how to keep moving despite what was missing. Out here, that skill felt more like a wound. You couldn't march past the empty chair at a dinner table. You couldn't dig a trench deep enough to hide from the look in your child's eyes when they measured the distance between you and didn't like the answer. The sound of the knife in the kitchen stopped. A cupboard door closed. Then Rachel's voice, calm but edged, calling Maddie for supper. Ethan stayed seated, listening to the faint scuff of socks on wood as Maddie obeyed. The smell of roasted chicken drifted in, warm and familiar, but he found himself unmoved. His gaze shifted back toward the hallway. The green door sat there like an unanswered letter. He didn't know what was behind it, but he could feel the weight of it in the air, pressing against the quiet. Maddie's glance earlier had been too quick to be casual, and the way Rachel's eyes had slid away when he'd asked about it yesterday still lingered in his mind. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing his hands together slowly. He had learned not to rush at the front lines, not to mistake the first visible thing for the real target. Here, in this narrow hallway of his own childhood home, he felt the same need for patience. From the kitchen came the faint scrape of chairs being pulled out, the soft clink of cutlery being set down, a murmur of Rachel's voice, then Maddie's, quieter. He stood, walked back into the hallway, and let his fingertips brush the wall as he passed the green door. It was cool to the touch, the paint rough beneath his skin. He joined them at the table without comment. Maddie sat across from him, her posture small, eyes flicking once toward the hallway before focusing on the plate in front of her. Rachel served portions with neat, practiced motions. The meal passed in near silence, broken only by the sounds of forks against plates. Ethan found his mind drifting again. Back to nights overseas when a meal meant survival, when you ate with one ear tuned to the wind. Here, there was no wind, only the steady beat of the clock on the wall and the unspoken questions gathering between the three of them. When the plates were cleared, he rose to help, but Rachel waved him off, stacking dishes into the sink herself. Maddie slipped away toward her room, the hem of her sweater brushing her knees. Ethan stepped once more into the hallway, the house now quieter than it had been all day. The green door stood where it always had, yet it seemed closer now, as if the shadows were pushing it toward him. He didn't touch it this time, not yet, but he knew he would. Soon, the night outside pressed against the windows, and somewhere deep in the house, something shifted, a sound so faint he might have imagined it. But it was enough to keep him standing there, in the narrow passage between what he knew and what he was about to find out. The next morning began without ceremony. A pale light slid across the kitchen floor, touching the legs of the chairs, the uneven grain of the table, the chipped rim of Maddie's cereal bowl. Ethan sat across from her, his own mug cooling between his hands. She ate quietly, spoon dipping in and out, eyes fixed on some spot beyond his shoulder. The air held the smell of brewed coffee, faintly bitter, and a sharper scent of disinfectant, something Rachel must have used earlier. He couldn't remember that smell from his childhood here. Back then the kitchen had always carried the warmth of bread baking, of pine cleaner that never quite masked the scent of damp wood. When Maddie reached across the table to pick up the salt shaker, the sleeve of her sweater slid back just enough. There, along the soft skin of her forearm, was a pale red line, not deep, not new, but the kind that spoke of something sharp brushing where it shouldn't have. His gaze lingered for the barest second before he met her eyes. She noticed, and almost too quickly, tugged her sleeve down. He didn't ask. The war had taught him to store certain observations, to carry them quietly until the moment you could do something about them. Still, the image of that thin mark stayed with him, like the faint outline of a path you'd walked once and could find again without thinking. Rachel entered then, her steps even, hair pulled back tight. She set a plate of toast on the table, glanced at Maddie, then at him. "It's nothing," she said, as if she'd overheard a question he hadn't spoken. She was climbing the fence out back. Her tone carried the kind of certainty that left no room for follow-up. Ethan nodded once, slow, neither agreeing nor pressing. Was all he gave her. The toast sat untouched on his plate. The morning moved in small motions. Maddie rinsed her bowl without being told, her sleeves still pulled low. Rachel busied herself at the counter, the clink of utensils a steady backdrop. Ethan found himself watching the way the light shifted through the blinds, striping the counter, moving toward the far wall. Time here felt different, elastic, stretching between moments. Weathered boards leaning slightly under years of wind. He walked along it, tracing the grain with his eyes, looking for places a sleeve might catch. There were plenty, splinters jutting, too deliberate. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves still clinging to the branches. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. He stood there, letting the cold seep into his fingers, letting the thought of that mark fold into the growing file of small, unshakable details he'd been collecting since stepping off the bus. When he came back in, Maddie was at the table drawing with a pencil worn to a stub. She didn't look up, but he saw her eyes flick toward the hallway before returning to the page. The line she drew was firm, unhesitating, a tall rectangle with no windows, just a single outline of a door. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat beside her, watching the image take shape. She shaded the door with slow, even strokes, then pressed the pencil hard along the edge as if to seal it. He didn't comment, didn't ask. The war had also taught him the value of letting a person finish what they needed to say before you stepped in. Rachel's voice called from the kitchen, asking Maddie to fetch something from her room. Maddie set the pencil down and left without a word. The drawing lay between them now, its rough lines stark against the white of the paper. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Another piece for the puzzle. At lunch, they sat again at the same table. The pattern repeating, Rachel portioning food neatly, Maddie eating in silence, Ethan somewhere between the two, his mind circling the same questions. This time, when Maddie reached for her water, her sleeve caught on the cuff of her sweater, pulling back just enough to reveal the tail end of another mark, faint but there. Rachel saw it too. She set her fork down, her smile just a little too quick. That's from last week, she said. She's always running around, climbing, bumping into things. Ethan looked at Maddie. The clock on the wall ticked past one. The day outside was bright now, the kind of cold light that makes everything sharp at the edges. Ethan finished his meal, pushed back his chair, and stood. Even if the lines were still faint. The afternoon leaned into that strange stillness small towns know too well. No cars passing, no voices outside. Just the steady drip of the kitchen tap and the muted tick of the wall clock. Ethan found himself moving through the house without aim, the way a man does when he's thinking more with his eyes than his feet. Rachel had gone to the front porch to make a phone call, her voice carrying in low, measured tones that dipped away whenever he drew near. Maddie was upstairs, the sound of something, a toy, maybe, rolling along the floorboards above him. He stayed in the kitchen, his hands loosely resting on the back of a chair. It was then he saw the packet, half-tucked behind a small radio on the shelf, a crumpled sleeve of pills. The foil punctured where some had been pressed out. The label was smudged, the print faint from moisture. But he could make out the last few letters of a name and a dosage that told him these weren't aspirin. His years in the service had made him familiar with certain kinds of medication, sedatives, and it wasn't the kind you forgot in plain sight unless you didn't think anyone would question it. He slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, not to hide it. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, but to keep it from disappearing before he understood what it meant. The rest of the kitchen was unremarkable in the way spaces become when someone has tried to make them forgettable. Counters wiped clean, no personal notes pinned to the fridge, no clutter in the sink. Yet in that sparseness was a kind of tension, as if the room had been stripped not for neatness, but to leave nothing for curious eyes to latch onto. He opened the back door, stepping out into the yard. The autumn air was sharper now, the sun sitting lower, throwing long shadows across the grass. The fence loomed at the far end, that same weathered wood he'd examined the day before. This time, he followed the edge toward the back corner, where the boards met the side of the house. There, almost hidden beneath a curling vine, was a small vent covered by a rusted grate. He crouched, tracing the metal with a finger. It was cool to the touch, and faintly, very faintly, there was a draft moving through it. A vent like this could carry sound. He imagined someone inside, pressed close, catching whispers from the outside world through this small opening. The vine crackled softly as he let it fall back into place. Standing, he glanced toward the upstairs window where Maddie's room sat. The curtains were drawn, but he could feel her presence. The way children sometimes seem to sense when they're being looked after, even from a distance. Back inside, the light in the hallway had changed. Afternoon gold slanted through the front windows, catching dust motes in the air. As he passed the green door again, he noticed something new, a faint scuff low on the wood, right where a shoe might hit if someone had kicked it lightly. The paint around it was worn thin, almost to the bare grain. "Go and start dinner soon," she said, moving past him into the kitchen. She didn't ask where he'd been, but he caught the quick glance she gave toward his jacket pocket before turning to the stove. Ethan sat in the living room while she worked, the scent of onions and garlic slowly filling the air. Maddie came down and settled at the small table with a schoolbook, her pencil moving in short bursts, pausing, then starting again. Every so often, she glanced toward the hallway, her eyes landing briefly on that same door before flicking back to the page. The packet of pills pressed against his side like a small, steady reminder. Alongside it, In another pocket was the folded drawing Maddie had left behind. Separate pieces, both incomplete. But together they began to suggest a shape. Dinner passed with the same rhythm as the previous night. Rachel speaking just enough to fill the air, Maddie mostly silent. Ethan answering in the smallest doses possible. The clock ticked toward evening, and the shadows stretched across the floor. Later, after the dishes were done and Maddie had gone upstairs, he stood at the window, looking out over the yard. The air had cooled sharply, and somewhere far off, a dog barked. He could see the fence, the vent, the patch of grass where the shadows of the trees fell like bars. He stayed there for a long time, not moving, the reflection of his own face ghosted in the glass. The house was quiet again. He knew the clues were no longer isolated. They were parts of the same story. All he had to do was be patient enough and careful enough to read it right. The following afternoon brought a thin, overcast light that seemed to flatten the colors of the town. From the living room window, Ethan could see the skeletal branches of the birch trees along the street bending in the wind. The last few leaves clinging on like they were afraid to let go. Rachel left around 2, calling out something about picking up groceries. Her voice carried down the hall, clipped and brisk. He watched her hand, the way it hesitated at certain lines, how her shoulders seemed to lift slightly each time the pencil met the paper. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was the sound of the wind working against the old siding, the muted creak of the house shifting, the occasional scratch of graphite. He found himself thinking that this was how it had always been with her. She spoke when she needed to, but her silences carried just as much weight. It happened in one of those silences. She paused in her drawing, staring down at the paper without moving. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She took a breath, so small it barely lifted her chest. And then, her tone was flat, almost matter-of-fact, but under it was a tremor, a thread of something too heavy for her age. Ethan didn't move. He didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't push for more. Years in uniform had taught him that sometimes the first thing someone says, they can only say once. If you rush them, it's gone. So he just looked at her, giving her space to decide if she wanted to fill the air again. She didn't. Instead, she lowered her eyes back to the paper, her pencil returning to its deliberate strokes. He could see now what she was drawing, 2 rectangles, one inside the other, like a door within a frame. Inside the smaller rectangle, faint lines suggested a face, though it was smudged almost to nothing. His gaze shifted toward the hallway. He didn't need her to say which there she meant. The green door was closed, just as it had been since the day he arrived, its paint dulled by years, and the handle catching what little light drifted in. The urge to stand, to walk down that hallway, and end the guessing, tightened in his chest. His boots firm against the floor, watching her draw until the lines stopped shaking. She flipped to a new page, sketching something lighter, a cat, maybe, or a bird. The kind of picture kids make when they want to leave a shadowed place behind, even just for a while. In the kitchen, the clock above the stove ticked toward 3. The sound was sharper than usual. The rusted vent in the yard, the muffled sounds he'd heard at night. They weren't separate things anymore. She set the groceries down with more noise than necessary, her gaze flicking briefly between them. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone casual, but the glance too quick, too measuring. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice to hide the change her absence had left behind. Maddie only gave a small shrug, her attention back on her notebook. The rest of the afternoon slid by in quiet motions, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge, the faint scrape of Maddie's pencil upstairs. Yet for Ethan, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of her words, echoing in a space he couldn't ignore. She's been there for days. When night came, and the house settled into its usual slow breathing, Ethan lay awake in the small guest room. The ceiling above him was faintly lit by the street lamp outside, the shadows of branches swaying across it. His mind kept returning to Maddie's voice, how it cracked just slightly, how it had been almost too quiet to catch. He knew that whatever waited behind that green door, he was closer now than he'd been since he came home. Not because of the clues he'd gathered, but because a 10-year-old had decided to trust him with the truth in its smallest, most fragile form. Ethan had passed it a dozen times since coming back, each time catching the green door at the end in the corner of his vision, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was an old paint, What had once been a deep forest color now faded to a muted sage, chipped along the edges where years of use had worn it down. That evening, Rachel was busy in the kitchen, the scent of overcooked vegetables drifting into the living room. Maddie was upstairs, the sound of her footsteps faint against the creaking boards. Ethan moved without announcing himself, his boots landing lightly on the runner rug that muted the sound. The closer he came to the door, the more aware he became of the air in the hallway, cooler than the rest of the house, with a faint smell of dust and something metallic, like old coins left in a damp place. His hand hovered near the brass handle, which was dull with age. He didn't touch it right away. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his ear a few inches from a seam between door and frame. At first, there was only the familiar hush of a closed room. But then, faint, so faint he almost convinced himself it was imagined, came the sound of breath. Not the slow, even breath of sleep, but quick and uneven, as though the person taking it was trying hard to make it silent. He let his hand rest against the handle. The metal was cold, as though the room beyond had no heat of its own. He pressed down gently, testing. It didn't budge. The lock held fast. A small clatter came from inside, something shifting or being moved hastily. He straightened, eyes narrowing, and looked back toward the kitchen. From where he stood, he could see Rachel's figure moving behind the counter, her back to him, her motions quick and tight. If she knew he was here, she didn't show it. Ethan stepped back from the door, just enough to let his breathing slow. Every instinct told him that whatever was inside was not meant to be there, or perhaps was meant to be there, but not in a way anyone should accept. He let his fingers trace the outline of the frame. The wood was slightly warped at the bottom, as though from moisture, and there was a thin, dark line of dust where the door met the floor. It looked undisturbed, except for one spot near the hinge where the dust had been brushed away recently. Upstairs, Maddie's door opened, and she came halfway down the stairs. She didn't speak, just stopped where she could see him. Her eyes flicked to the green door, then back to him, feeling the faintest vibration, not from movement, but from the low hum of tension, the way an enclosed space sometimes seems to carry the charge of its secrets. He pulled his hand back, flexing it, standing near the coat rack, as if he'd been looking for something there. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Dinner's ready," she said, her voice even. He nodded, following her back toward the kitchen, though his mind remained at the end of the hall. He had not seen what was inside, but he had heard enough, and the sound of that unsteady breathing would follow him through the meal, through the dishes, through the restless hours of the night. When the house finally went quiet, Ethan lay awake in the guest room. He pictured the green door in the dim light of the hallway. Imagine the thin strip of shadow beneath it. Imagine someone on the other side watching that same strip for the telltale change in light when footsteps approached. He thought of Maddie's whisper the day before. She's been there for days, and the way she hadn't said another word after. He thought of the clatter inside the room when he touched the handle, of the air cooler than it should be, of the uneven breath. The truth was no longer just a suspicion now. It was something tangible, pressed against the other side of a locked door, as real as the key he didn't have. And the longer it stayed shut, the more certain he became that opening it would change everything, not just for whoever was inside, but for Maddie, for himself, and for the fragile shape of this household that had pretended to be whole. He closed his eyes, but the image stayed. The green door, waiting. The house at night had its own kind of language. Ethan had learned it in fragments since coming back. The tick of the wall clock in the living room, the low groan of wood settling in the rafters, the faint hum of the old refrigerator. These were the ordinary sounds, the ones you could grow accustomed to if you stayed long enough. But that night, there was something else. He had been sitting at the small desk in the guest room, leafing through a weathered notebook from his deployment days when it reached him. A sound so fragile it barely pierced the quiet, a small, muffled sob. He stilled, pen in hand. It wasn't Maddie. Her bedroom was upstairs, and this sound came from somewhere nearer, somewhere on the same floor. He held his breath, letting the night speak again. There it was, faint but steady, a rhythm of sobbing that seemed to stop whenever the person drew in a shaky breath, then start again in a low, stifled wail. It was the sound of someone trying not to be heard. The green door was there at the end, just as it had been earlier. Only now, it wasn't just a silent mystery. Now it was breathing. Now it was crying. He moved closer, each step deliberate. As he approached, the sobbing grew more distinct, though still strained, as if it was coming through cupped hands or a blanket pulled over a face. But this time, the vibration was unmistakable, a small, uneven shiver from the other side. He could almost feel the sound through his skin. A part of him wanted to call out, to say something gentle, something to let whoever was inside know that they weren't alone. But another part knew that words might make them retreat even further into their silence. And then, just as if the motion had triggered it, the crying stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sobs, no movement, just stillness, so complete it felt unnatural. Then, behind him, a floorboard creaked. He turned, and there was Rachel at the far end of the hall, her figure outlined by the light spilling from the kitchen. She was holding a mug, steam curling upward. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, sharp, unblinking, were fixed on him. "Don't." Her voice cut through the quiet, low and quick, as if she didn't want it to carry to the other side of the door. Ethan didn't answer. He kept his hand on the knob, his gaze locked on hers. The moments stretched, the air between them heavy with unspoken challenge. Rachel took a step closer, then another, her slippers whispering against the rug. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said, her tone too smooth, too practiced. Ethan let the knob go, slowly. The release made a soft metallic sigh. Rachel stopped halfway down the hall, as if the space between them was a line she didn't want to cross. "We'll talk in the morning," she said, and then she turned back toward the kitchen. The smell of chamomile followed her as she disappeared. He stayed where he was, the locked door at his side. His hand tingled faintly from the cold of the metal. He listened for the crying again, but the silence held. Back in the guest room, he sat on the edge of the bed without turning on a light. He knew that whatever was happening behind that door, it wasn't going away. The sounds he'd heard weren't the sounds of someone who was just fine or resting. They were the sounds of someone trapped, by fear, by circumstance, by whoever had the key. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The ticking clock in the living room was faint here, almost lost to the distance. He thought of Maddie's thin voice the other day. "She's been there for days." The words carried more weight now, solid and undeniable. Out the window, the street lamp cast a pale circle on the sidewalk. A moth fluttered in and out of the light, persistent and aimless. Ethan watched it for a long time, thinking about how some creatures spent their whole lives circling something they could never touch. He wasn't going to be that moth. The night stretched on, sleepless. He listened for the crying again, but it didn't return. Still, it was enough. He had heard enough to know that tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever the moment came, he would not stop at the locked door. The green paint, the warped wood, the cold brass handle. He had memorized every detail. And the sound of that muffled sob would follow him into whatever came next. Morning came in shades of gray. Clouds hung low over the street outside, the kind that swallowed the edges of rooftops and blurred the trees in the distance. Ethan had been up for hours, his body running on the taut energy of a man who knew something was wrong but couldn't yet name it. Rachel moved through the kitchen like she always did, quiet, precise. The clink of plates, the low hiss of the kettle, the faint smell of burnt toast. Maddie sat at the table, her hair pulled into a neat braid that seemed too tight for a Saturday. "Going out to the market later?" Rachel said without looking at him. It was the kind of sentence meant to close a conversation before it began. He nodded once. "I'll be here." By the time Rachel left, the air in the house shifted. It was subtle, like a room exhaling after being held too long. Ethan waited a few minutes, enough to hear the crunch of her tires fade down the street, before stepping into the hall. Her socked feet making no sound on the worn rug. She stood a few paces back, chewing the edge of her sleeve. "Stay there," Ethan said gently. She didn't move closer, but she didn't retreat either. His hand closed around the knob. Cold as always. He tried it, still locked. His other hand went to the set of house keys Rachel had left in the ceramic dish by the door. He tested each one until a small, sharp click broke the stillness. The moment the latch gave, the air changed. A faint scent drifted out, stale blankets, unwashed clothes, and something sour underneath, the smell of a room that had been shut too long. He pushed the door open. Light from the hall spilled into the space, illuminating the small figure on the far side of the room. She was curled into the corner of a narrow bed, knees to chest, arms wrapped tight. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair tangled into knots. The pale skin of her wrist stood out against the fabric. Her eyes, wide, startled, locked onto his as if she'd been caught doing something wrong, though she was the one confined here. The pupils shrank in the sudden light. Don't. Rachel's voice cut through the air from behind him, sharp and urgent. He turned to see her at the end of the hall, groceries still clutched in her arms. The paper bag crinkled in her grip. But Ethan didn't step back. He stayed in the doorway, his frame filling it. He looked at Rachel, then at the girl, then back again. What's going on here? His voice was low, controlled. Not an accusation, yet but close. Rachel's eyes flickered to Maddie, who was now standing behind Ethan, peeking past his side. It's not what you think, she said. But the way her gaze darted toward the girl betrayed her. Ethan stepped inside the room, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The girl flinched at the sound. He kept his movements slow, lowering himself into a crouch so he wouldn't tower over her. It's okay, he said quietly. You're safe now. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked past him toward Rachel, as if waiting for permission to speak. Rachel set the groceries on the hall table with a dull thud. Ethan, she's not supposed to be here. That much is obvious, he replied, still watching the girl. Question is, why is she here at all? The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Maddie took a tentative step into the doorway, her small hand finding the seam of Ethan's jacket. Rachel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. She had nowhere else to go, and it was complicated. Complicated? The word came out like he was tasting it, weighing it. He glanced around the room. No dresser, no fresh clothes, no sign this was anything but a place to keep someone hidden. The girl shifted on the bed, her eyes dropping to her lap. Her fingers twisted the hem of her shirt until the fabric was tight in her grasp. Ethan stood, his full height casting a long shadow in the cramped space. He stepped aside, giving the girl a clear path to the door. Come on, he said softly. Rachel took a step forward. Ethan, don't. He turned to her then, and something in his eyes made her stop mid-stride. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was the unyielding resolve of someone who had seen too much harm done in the dark and wasn't about to let it happen again. She's coming with us, he said. For a long beat, Rachel didn't move. Then she stepped back, her arms folding across her chest. You're making a mistake. Ethan didn't answer. He reached out his hand, and after a hesitant moment, the girl placed her small, cold fingers in his. Maddie moved to the other side, taking the girl's other hand. Together, they stepped into the hallway. The green door swung, closed behind them with a quiet finality, as if the house itself was relieved to have its secret let out. The living room felt smaller than Ethan remembered, as if the walls had shifted closer during his absence. The afternoon light through the thin curtains painted narrow stripes across the floor, and in those stripes stood Rachel, her arms folded tight, chin lifted but eyes darting. The girl from the green door sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders rounded forward, knees pressed together. Maddie was next to her, close enough that their elbows touched. Ethan stood a few steps away, his back straight, hands resting loosely at his sides, though every muscle in him was wound tight. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence grow, the kind that forces the truth to rise like something trapped under ice. The clock in the kitchen ticked, and somewhere outside a truck downshifted, gears grinding before fading away. Rachel broke first. You think I meant her harm, she said, her voice sharp at the edges. I think you kept her locked in a room, Ethan answered, not raising his tone. He didn't need to. Rachel looked at Maddie, as if expecting the girl to retreat to her room, but Maddie stayed where she was. Her small hand rested on the couch cushion between herself and the other girl, palm flat. Steady. You don't understand. Rachel tried again. Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together before continuing. She showed up one night. I didn't know what to do. People would have asked questions. And your answer, Ethan said slowly, was to lock the door. Rachel's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes fell to the floor, tracing the stripes of sunlight. It was temporary, she murmured. Temporary is a night, Ethan replied. A day, maybe. Not. However long Maddie's been hearing her in there. The girl shifted on the couch. The motion small, but enough to draw his attention. Her hair fell forward, hiding most of her face. What's your name? Ethan asked gently. She hesitated, glancing at Rachel before answering. Leah. The word was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room. Ethan nodded once, letting the name settle in the air like a promise. Leah, has anyone hurt you? Leah's hands twisted together in her lap. She didn't answer right away, and when she did, her voice trembled. Not here, but before. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on a spot beyond the window. I was protecting her, she said, more to the glass than to Ethan. By hiding her? Ethan asked, his tone softer now, but no less firm. By making her afraid to step into the hallway? Rachel's eyes snapped back to his. You've been gone for years, Ethan. You don't know what this town does to people who don't fit their neat little picture. You think they'd have welcomed her? You think they'd have asked how they could help? I think, Ethan said, taking a step closer, you could have tried. For a moment, the weight of his words filled the room, pressing down on all three of them. Maddie leaned slightly toward Leah, as if to shield her from whatever might come next. Ethan turned to Leah again. Do you want to stay here? She shook her head quickly, the motion so sudden it made her hair sway. Then you won't, he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Rachel's shoulders dropped, her arms unfolding at last. You're going to make this harder than it needs to be. I've seen hard, Ethan replied. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. This isn't it. Maddie stood now, her small frame tense. Dad, she said quietly, not as a plea, but as an anchor. Ethan looked at her, then at Leah, then back at Rachel. This ends today, he said. No more locked doors. Rachel didn't argue. She sank into the armchair across from the couch, her hands gripping the armrests, as though holding herself in place. Ethan crouched slightly, so he was at level with Leah. We'll figure this out, he told her. The words were quiet, meant only for her, but Maddie heard them too. Leah's eyes filled, not with the sharp, panicked fear he'd seen before, but with something slower, heavier. She nodded once. Rachel stayed silent, her gaze drifting again to the window. The sound of the clock in the kitchen filled the space between them, its steady rhythm a reminder that time, like truth, couldn't be held back forever. Ethan straightened, the decision already made. Ethan didn't remember standing up. One moment he was crouched in front of Leah, the next he was upright, his shadow stretching long across the worn rug. He reached down and took her hand, not gripping, just letting his palm be there, steady, warm. She looked at it for a breath before letting her fingers curl around his. Maddie slid off the couch and moved to his other side without a word. Her small hand found his arm, just above the elbow, the way she used to when she was younger, back when the world felt simpler and his presence was enough to make it so. Rachel's voice came from the armchair, quieter than before, but laced with a brittle edge. You're not taking her anywhere. She's not your responsibility. Ethan didn't look at her. She's a kid, he said. That's all the responsibility I need. The house seemed to hold its breath as they moved toward the hallway. Ethan could feel Rachel watching them, but she didn't stand, didn't follow. The carpet muffled their steps, but the boards underfoot still groaned faintly, old wood announcing every departure. They passed the closed green door. For a flicker of a second, Ethan saw the ghost of its secrecy, the dim light under the crack, the faint sound of someone pacing inside. Then they were beyond it, past the kitchen with its clock ticking like an impatient metronome, past the narrow counter with a chipped enamel bowl where Rachel kept keys that weren't for him. At the front door, Ethan reached for the coat hooks. Maddie's small windbreaker was already there, and Leah's jacket, a thin, faded thing, hung beside it. He helped Leah into it, feeling the fragility of her shoulders under the fabric. The hinges gave a small sigh when he opened the door. Cool air rolled in, carrying the scent of late autumn, damp leaves, chimney smoke from somewhere down the street, that faint metallic bite of the season turning. Outside, the light was softening toward evening. The porch boards flexed under their combined weight. Leah hesitated at the top step, blinking against the open sky as though it might collapse in on her. Maddie kept close, her hand brushing Leah's sleeve. The street was quiet except for the rustle of dry leaves along the curb. Ethan led them down the walk, his steps measured. Behind him, he thought he heard Rachel shift in her chair, but there was no voice calling after them, no sound of pursuit. Only the closing door, a muted click that felt like an ending. They walked the few blocks to where Ethan had parked his truck. The old Chevy sat under the bare limbs of a maple tree, a scatter of orange leaves on the hood. He opened the passenger door for the girls. Maddie climbed in first, sliding across the bench seat so Leah could follow. Leah moved like someone stepping into unknown terrain, each motion careful, deliberate. Inside the cab, The air smelled faintly of engine oil and the cedar block Ethan kept under the seat. He started the truck, the engine's low rumble settling into a steady rhythm. Neither girl spoke. Maddie stared out her window at the houses passing by, the yellow porch lights flicking on one by one. Leah kept her gaze on her lap, fingers tracing the seam of her jacket. Ethan drove toward the small clinic on Main Street. He didn't rush. There was no need. They'd already crossed the most important threshold, out of the locked room into open air. The rest could happen step by step. When they pulled up to the clinic, the windows glowed warm against the deepening dusk. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. A nurse looked up from behind the desk, her eyes moving from Ethan to the two girls at his side. "She needs to be checked," Ethan said simply, nodding toward Leah. The nurse's expression softened in a way that told him she understood more than she was letting on. "This way," she said, guiding them toward an exam room. Ethan stayed with Leah while the nurse and doctor worked quietly. Maddie sat on a chair in the corner, swinging her legs, eyes fixed on her father as though measuring the shape of this new version of him. One who was home, one who acted without hesitation. The exam took time. There were questions, a gentle check of her breathing, a careful look at her arms where faint bruises lingered in yellow and green. Leah didn't say much, but she didn't flinch away from the doctor's touch. That Ethan thought was something. When it was over, the doctor handed Ethan a short list on a clipboard, follow-up appointments, nutritional guidance, a counselor's number. "She's underweight," the doctor said in a low voice, but otherwise stable. "Just keep her somewhere safe." Ethan folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and nodded once. "I will." They left the clinic together. The night had settled fully now, the street lamps casting pale halos on the sidewalk. As they walked back to the truck, Leah's steps began to match his. Not in perfect sync, but close enough. When they reached the truck, Maddie climbed in first again, but this time Leah followed without hesitation. As Ethan slid behind the wheel, he caught her looking, not at him, but out the windshield toward the road ahead. He started the engine, the rumble filling the cab. For the first time all day, the silence between them didn't feel like something to be broken. It felt like the first layer of trust settling into place. Ethan steered them toward home. Not Rachel's house, not the locked door, but somewhere else. Somewhere light could come through the windows, where no one needed permission to open a door. They drove on, the night unfolding ahead of them, each mile a little further from the past, a little closer to something worth keeping. The porch light over Officer Blake's place still flickered the way it had years ago, when Ethan used to drop by after his shifts at the mill, before deployments and long absences made visits rare. The house sat on the corner of Birch and 2nd, low-roofed and wide, with a flag that moved only when the wind had the will. Tonight, the flag hung still. Ethan parked under the street lamp, the soft yellow glow brushing the truck's hood. Maddie was already asleep, head tipped against the window, her small breaths fogging the glass. Leah wasn't asleep, but she was close, eyes heavy, posture loose in a way that came only when the body began to believe it was safe. He left the engine running, the heater humming low, and stepped out into the cool night. Gravel shifted under his boots as he crossed to Blake's door. He didn't knock hard, just enough to let his presence carry through. A moment later, the door opened, and Blake stood there in a worn sweatshirt, hair mussed, the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere inside. "Cole," Blake said, his tone steady but edged with the unspoken. He glanced past Ethan toward the truck, his gaze pausing when he spotted the second figure in the passenger seat. Something happened. Ethan didn't waste words. "Yeah, need to talk." Inside, the living room felt the same as it always had, wood-paneled walls, an old deer mount over the mantel, the faint creak of the floor where Blake's dog used to sleep. The coffee pot gurgled in the kitchen. Blake poured them each a mug, set one in front of Ethan, and sat. Ethan began with the small things. How he'd seen Maddie leaving food by the green door, the sound of someone breathing behind it, the thinness in Leah's face. He spoke plainly, no drama, just facts. That was the thing about soldiers. You learned to strip the story down to what could be acted on. Blake listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around his mug. When Ethan mentioned the night's events, the unlocked door, the look in Leah's eyes, Blake leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You're saying she was kept there? Not just visiting, not staying by choice." Ethan nodded once. "You don't get those marks from choice." Blake exhaled through his nose, reached for a small notepad from the side table, and began jotting. "I've heard things," he said. "Neighbors mention noises late. One said they thought they saw Rachel at the hardware store buying his second lock. Didn't think much of it at the time. They talked quietly, the way men do when the weight of the subject doesn't need to be filled with volume. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, tires whispering over asphalt, then fading. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. He'd written down the contents of Maddie's brief whisper from 2 days earlier. Nothing more than a line, but enough. She's been there for days. He slid across the table. Blake read it, then tucked it into his notepad. That's the kind of thing that doesn't go away, he said, voice low. The conversation shifted to the next steps, what could be done without drawing attention, how to verify who Leo was, and whether anyone had reported her missing. Blake said he'd start with a quiet check of recent reports, cross-reference names with nearby schools, maybe talk to Dr. Henson at the clinic under the guise of follow-up care. Ethan didn't say much after that. He just sat with the warmth of the coffee in his hands, letting the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional pop from the baseboard heater fill the space. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was the feeling of a line being cast across a river. You didn't know what you'd pull in, but you had the start of something that could connect the banks. When the mugs were empty, Ethan stood. Blake walked him to the door, and they paused there for a moment under the flicker of the porch light. "Keep them close," Blake said, nodding toward the truck. "And don't go back there alone. If she knows you've been to me, things could get messy." Ethan gave a short nod. "I'm not leaving them." Back in the truck, Maddie stirred but didn't wake fully. Leah shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing Ethan's arm as he settled in. The heater's soft breath filled the cab, and the night outside seemed to close in just enough to make the space feel contained, almost safe. They drove slowly back toward the small rental Ethan had taken after returning home, a single-story place with peeling paint and a yard that hadn't seen much care. It wasn't much, but it had a working lock on every door, and no one there needed permission to speak. Once inside, he guided the girls to the bedroom. Maddie climbed into the bed without protest, curling toward the wall. Leah hesitated a moment before sitting on the edge, eyes darting to the window. Ethan pulled the curtains, leaving just a thin line of streetlight along the floor. He sat in the old armchair in the corner, boots still on, watching the slow rise and fall of their breathing. The house was quiet, but not empty. There was a difference. In the army, he'd learned to tell when silence was a warning and when it was an offering. Tonight, it was the latter. In the dim light, Ethan felt the threads beginning to connect. Maddie's guardedness, Rachel's evasions, Leah's hollow stare. Blake's notepad was the start of a map, but it was the lived moments, the tiny, almost invisible details that would fill it in. He leaned back, eyes half closed, letting the low hum of the radiator lull the edges of his vigilance. Tomorrow would bring more steps, more questions. But for now, the two girls slept in the same room, the door open, no locks between them and the world. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the river he'd been stranded on for years had a bridge somewhere ahead. The morning came without hurry. Light leaked through the thin curtains in long, pale stripes, dust motes drifting in the beam like slow-moving snow. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, boots unlaced, the radio low enough to be more hum than voice. Outside, the frost still clung to the grass in the shaded parts of the yard, a silver crust that would be gone by mid-morning. The girls were still in the bedroom. Maddie slept curled beneath the quilt, her hair a tangle on the pillow. Leah wasn't sleeping. He could tell by the subtle shift of her shadow against the wall, but she stayed in bed, eyes toward the window. The quiet between them had its own kind of weight, not oppressive but careful. By 9, Officer Blake had already started making calls. He didn't say much on the phone last night about what he'd do first, but Ethan knew him well enough to understand he'd begin with what could be done without stirring too much noise. In small towns like theirs, once he made a sound, it traveled. Ethan's own phone buzzed on the counter. A short text from Blake, stopping by Dr. Henson's now. We'll update. No more than that. The kind of brevity that meant something was moving. Ethan took the moment to step out into the yard. The air was crisp, and his breath fogged before him. Across the street, Mrs. Kearns was sweeping her porch in her housecoat, as she had for the past 30 years. She gave him a nod, a faint lift of her chin, the same way neighbors used to before long deployments. Acknowledgement without intrusion. Back inside, the radiator ticked softly as it warmed. Ethan sat again at the table, running his thumb along the edge of the mug. In the service, he'd learned that waiting could feel heavier than action. Here at home, it was no different. It was nearly noon when Blake called. His voice was low, but there was an edge under it. Henson remembers her, Blake said. Saw her twice in the last 3 months. No records under her name. Rachel registered her as temporary guardian, using her own surname. No emergency contact listed. Last visit, Leah had bruises, underweight, and, well, you know the rest. Ethan let the silence hold. He didn't need every detail. The tone said enough. That alone, Blake continued, isn't enough to push through. But there's more. I ran a check with county records. No report filed about a missing girl matching her description in this county. But he paused. 2 counties over, there's a welfare inquiry still open on a girl who vanished from a foster placement last winter. Age and description line up close. I'm sending you the photo. You tell me. The image arrived as a message, grainy, like it had been scanned from an old file. But the eyes were the same. Even under different lighting, with more weight in her face and a hint of a smile in the photo, Ethan knew. Leah, she hasn't said a word about it. Ethan murmured. She might not, Blake replied. Not yet, but this gives us a thread. I can't move in official capacity until we tie it tighter. And if Rachel catches wind. She won't, Ethan said. After the call, he stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the frost that was now retreating from the yard. He thought of the way Leah had flinched at the porch light the night before, how her eyes searched the corners of any room she entered. You didn't lose habits like that easily. Maddie wandered in, rubbing her eyes, wearing one of Ethan's old flannel shirts that draped over her knees. She opened the cupboard without a word, poured cereal into a bowl. She moved differently now, slower, as if watching what her actions might set in motion. Morning, he said. She gave a small nod, spoon clinking softly against the bowl. Leah followed a few minutes later, hair pulled into a loose braid Maddie must have done. She didn't speak, but she sat at the table and kept her hands wrapped around the ceramic mug Ethan had set in front of her, steam from the tea rising between her fingers. He didn't press them with questions. Instead, he talked about small things, the weather changing, the way the old maple out front would drop its leaves all at once when the next storm came. Sometimes you had to build normalcy, like stacking kindling before fire. You didn't strike the match too soon. The day passed in small pieces. Ethan fixed the back gate that had been sagging since spring. Maddie read on the couch. Leah stayed close to the window, but never opened it. He kept the radio low, tuned to the station that still played local baseball games and farm reports. Late in the afternoon, Blake's truck rolled up outside. He didn't come in, just called Ethan out to the sidewalk. The sun was setting, turning the frostless grass into a dull gold. I spoke to a contact at Child Services over in Mason County, Blake said. They can't confirm without a positive ID from her or a guardian willing to step in. But they know the case. And they know Rachel. Ethan's jaw tightened. Ow! She was investigated 2 years ago. Neglect. Dropped before it went to court. They stood there for a long minute, watching the light fade over the rooftops. What's next? Ethan asked. I'll get the county investigator to make an unannounced visit. You keep them here. No contact with Rachel if you can help it. If she comes around, call me first. Ethan nodded. The plan was thin, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. And in cases like this, progress wasn't measured in leaps. It was the slow, quiet shift of pieces moving into place, the way ice on a river broke a little more each day until one morning it was gone entirely. That night, Ethan sat in the armchair again, the girls asleep in the bed. He thought about the photo Blake had sent, the almost smile in it, and how far Leah had traveled, maybe not in miles, but in everything else that mattered. He knew the next steps wouldn't be clean. They never were. But the thread had been found, and that was enough to keep pulling. The county investigator didn't arrive in the morning. That was deliberate. Blake had told Ethan they would come in the afternoon, when the day had settled into its slow rhythm, when people tended to let their guard down. In towns like this, visitors stood out. Timing was as much part of the work as the questions themselves. Ethan spent the morning keeping the air calm inside the house. He moved through small chores, tightening the screws on a loose cupboard door, oiling the hinges on the back porch, refilling the bird feeder near the kitchen window. Every movement was quiet, measured. Maddie followed him for a while, holding the box of screws, before drifting off to her own corner of the living room to sketch. Leah kept to the bedroom for most of the morning. Once, he caught her in the hallway, her fingers grazing the wood grain of the closed front door as if memorizing its pattern. She looked up when she noticed him, not startled, just caught in a thought she didn't explain. The air outside was brittle with late autumn chill. Clouds hung low, moving slow enough that the light stayed muted all day. Around 2, Ethan put on a fresh pot of coffee. That's when the sound came. 3 knocks, steady but unhurried. He opened the door to a woman in a navy coat, a leather satchel hanging from her shoulder. She introduced herself simply, Mary Ann Keller, Mason County Child Services. Her voice was level, her expression one of practiced neutrality, though Ethan caught the quick scan of her eyes as she looked past him into the house. "May I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden floor as she entered. She didn't sit right away, but glanced toward the living room where Maddie was still drawing. Leah appeared in the doorway a moment later, her braids slightly looser than in the morning. "This is Leah?" Keller asked. Ethan nodded. He didn't say more. Keller crouched slightly to meet Leah's eye level, her tone shifting into something gentler without losing its steadiness. "I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. You can answer as much or as little as you want." Leah's eyes flicked toward Ethan, who gave her a small nod. It wasn't permission, it was reassurance. She moved to the couch, sitting with her hands clasped in her lap. The question started simply. What was her full name? Her age? Where had she been living before Rachel's house? Leah answered the first two quietly. The third she didn't touch. Keller didn't press. Instead, she asked if Leah remembered the last time she'd been to school or a doctor. Leah hesitated, then mentioned a school 2 towns away. The name matched the district in the open inquiry Blake had told Ethan about. Ethan watched Keller make a small note in her pad. No reaction, just a slow, deliberate script. She shifted the questions toward the present. What her days looked like now, if she felt safe here. Leah's gaze dropped to the floorboards. "I sleep better here," she said. It was the only full sentence she gave. Keller looked at Ethan for a moment, and he caught the meaning. It wasn't everything, but it was enough for now. Before she left, Keller asked if she could see the room Leah was staying in. Ethan led her down the hall, past the door that had once been locked. Leah's things were few: folded clothes on a chair, a stack of borrowed books, Maddie's old quilt on the bed. But the window was clear, and the curtains were open to the pale daylight. Keller stood there for a long moment, then turned to Ethan. "I'll file my report tonight. I'll need to speak with Officer Blake again. Until we get the court involved, keep things as steady as you can." He understood. Steady was what they could manage. After she left, the house felt quieter than before. Not empty, but the kind of quiet that follows a conversation you know will change something. Maddie went back to her drawing. Leah lingered by the window, watching Keller's car disappear down the street. It was nearly dark when the phone rang. "Blake, she's going to recommend immediate protective custody for Leah," he said. "It's not final until the judge signs, but Keller's report will push it forward. Rachel's not going to like it." Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the living room, where the girls were now side by side on the couch, Maddie showing Leah how to shade the edges of her sketch. It wasn't laughter, but there was a softness to their posture, a loosening. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Let her not like it." Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Ethan stood at the front door, the porch light casting a narrow pool on the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. He could almost feel the tension in the air, like the stillness before change in weather. Whatever came next, they were past the point of pretending nothing was wrong. The knock had come, and it stayed long enough to be heard. The courthouse in Mason County had no grandeur to it. No marble columns, no high arch ceilings, just a square brick building with a flag out front and a wooden bench under the lone oak in the yard. The inside smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, the kind of scent that clung to small-town offices where everything had been filed by hand for decades. Ethan arrived early. He always did. Maddie sat beside him in the hallway, her legs too short to rest flat on the floor, heels knocking lightly against the wooden bench. Leah sat on her other side, the quilted jacket zipped all the way to her chin, eyes scanning the unfamiliar corridors. Rachel appeared 10 minutes before the hearing. She didn't look hurried. She never did. But her hair was pulled back too tightly, and the set of her mouth was sharper than Ethan remembered. Behind her walked a man in a pressed gray suit, the kind of attorney who carried a leather portfolio and rarely raised his voice. When Rachel saw the girls, her eyes didn't soften. Instead, they narrowed slightly, like she was calculating something. She turned to the attorney, murmured a few words, and they both stepped into the hearing room without looking back. Inside, the space felt even smaller than the hallway. A long table on each side, a single row of chairs for observers, and the judge's bench raised just high enough to remind you who decided what mattered. Judge Harper sat already, reading over a file. He didn't look up when they entered, just gestured for everyone to sit. Keller from Child Services took a seat near Ethan, her pad already open, pen poised. Blake stood quietly in the back, in uniform but not here as an enforcer, more as a presence. Ethan felt it, steady behind him. Rachel's attorney began with an argument polished to a smooth edge. He spoke of misunderstandings, of temporary arrangements, of concerns blown out of proportion. He acknowledged Leah's presence in the house, but framed it as informal fostering that had not yet gone through the proper channels. Every phrase was measured to sound reasonable without conceding fault. Ethan didn't interrupt. He didn't even shift in his seat. The years in uniform had taught him that stillness could be its own kind of pressure. Then Rachel's attorney moved to the subject of custody. "My client," he said, "believes it is in Maddie's best interest to remain in a stable environment, one she has known for years, rather than be uprooted into a situation where the household is already strained by the addition of another dependent minor." It was a clean blow, and Ethan felt it land, not because it was true, but because it was designed to sound like it might be. Keller spoke next. Her voice was even, but there was a weight behind it. She described her visit, Leah's physical state, her statements, the condition of the room. She did not embellish. She didn't need to. In a place like this, facts were louder than speeches. Then Harper looked to Ethan. "Mr. Cole, do you wish to make a statement?" Ethan rose slowly. He didn't read from notes. "Maddie's my daughter," he said. "Leah's not, but she's a child in my care. Neither one of them should have to live behind a locked door or be afraid to speak. That's all I've got to say." It was short. Harper nodded, as if brevity was a kind of respect here. Rachel was called to the stand. She painted a different picture, one where Leah had been given shelter and privacy, where the locked door was for her safety, where Ethan's return was unexpected and disruptive. Her voice wavered once, but it wasn't with remorse. It was with irritation, the kind you hear when someone feels cornered. Halfway through her testimony, Leah shifted in her seat. Maddie reached for her hand under the table, and Leah's shoulders eased a fraction. Ethan saw it in the corner of his vision and let the sight anchor him. When it was Leah's turn, she didn't look at Rachel. She answered each question from Keller and the judge directly, her voice quiet but clear. She described the room, the meals left at the door, the days without seeing sunlight. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. And when Harper asked if she felt safe with Ethan, she nodded once. "Yes, sir." Silence held the room for a moment after that. You could hear the radiator ticking in the corner. Harper leaned back, steepling his fingers. Given the testimony, the report from Child Services, and the corroborating observations from Officer Blake, the court finds sufficient cause to grant Mr. Cole temporary custody of both minors pending further review. It wasn't final, but it was immediate. The gavel struck wood with a sound that carried more weight than volume. Rachel's attorney gathered his papers without looking at Ethan. Rachel herself didn't move for a moment. When she finally stood, she glanced toward Maddie, not with longing, but with a kind of cold appraisal, as though measuring distance she might one day try to close. Outside, the air was sharper than when they'd gone in. Leah stood just off the courthouse steps, breathing in the cold. Maddie was beside her, holding her sketch pad against her chest. Ethan didn't say much on the walk back to the truck. They didn't need words. The sound of their steps on the pavement was enough, steady and in sync, 3 sets moving forward together into whatever came next. The first snow of the season came quietly, the way winter sometimes does in Mason County. Without warning, without wind, just a steady sift of white that seemed to hush the whole town. By dawn, the streets were covered, the roofs soft and rounded, and the oak tree in the yard bowed gently under the weight. Ethan woke early, not because of habit from the army, though that was part of it, but because the house sounded different under snow. The usual hums and creaks were muffled, as though the cold had wrapped the place in a thick blanket. He stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the flakes fall against the gray-blue sky. The house was still unfamiliar in some ways. His boots stood by the back door, but the scuff marks on the baseboards weren't his. The dent in the old kitchen table came from years before he'd returned. He didn't try to erase those traces. He just moved carefully around them, the way you do when you're still learning the shape of space. Upstairs, he heard the slow, uneven footsteps of children waking. Maddie appeared first, her hair a tangle, wearing the oversized sweatshirt she liked to sleep in. She padded into the kitchen and leaned against him without a word. Leah followed a minute later, holding her quilt around her shoulders. She still moved like someone expecting to be told where she could and couldn't stand. But her eyes, though wary, no longer darted to the nearest exit. Breakfast was quiet, not from tension, but from the kind of morning calm that doesn't need filling. Ethan poured coffee into his chipped mug, set the kettle for hot chocolate, and listened to the sound of spoons against bowls. Maddie hummed under her breath, something tuneless but warm. After they'd eaten, he suggested they check on the shed out back. The roof had been sagging even before the snow, and he didn't want the weight to finish the job. Maddie pulled on her boots without complaint. Leah hesitated, then fetched her own coat from the hook by the door. The air outside bit at their cheeks, but the light was clean and sharp. Their breath rose in white clouds as they crossed the yard. Inside the shed, the air smelled of old wood and motor oil. Ethan cleared a path to the workbench, showing the girls where the tools were kept, how to hand him nails, how to hold a ladder steady. It wasn't glamorous work. They hammered down loose boards, brushed snow from the shingles, and patched a leak with tar paper. But each small task had a rhythm, and in that rhythm, the three of them moved together without having to think about it. Later, back inside, Leah surprised him by taking a broom to the kitchen floor without being asked. Maddie started sketching the shed in her pad, capturing the uneven roofline and the way the snow sat on top like icing. That afternoon, the girls sat by the front window, watching the snowplow crawl down the street. Ethan took the chance to fix the loose hinge on Maddie's bedroom door and oil the old lock on Leah's. It wasn't just about making things work. It was about erasing the sound of a door that had once been forced to stay shut. Around dusk, the snow stopped. The clouds thinned enough to let the last of the daylight through, painting the yard in pale gold. Ethan stood on the porch for a long time, feeling the boards cool under his feet. He could hear the girls inside, arguing softly over which movie to watch. He didn't think of it as victory, not the kind you can frame or celebrate. It was smaller than that. It was knowing the heat would stay on through the night, that the fridge held enough for breakfast, that no one would lock a door against the people in this house. As night settled, they piled onto the couch under a single blanket, the three of them squeezed together in the dim light of the TV. Leah leaned her head lightly against his arm. Maddie's hand found his without looking. Outside, the snow reflected the porch light, making the yard seem brighter than it should be at that hour. Inside, the air was warm enough to make the windows fog. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet sink in. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was enough to feel like the start of something that might last. By late March, winter had loosened its grip. The yard still held a few stubborn patches of snow, tucked into shaded corners near the fence, but the rest of the ground was damp with the thaw. Thin blades of grass were beginning to push through, tentative and pale. Ethan stood on the front porch with a mug of coffee, watching the street in that early hour when the town was still between sleep and movement. The postman's truck hadn't yet made its rounds. Even the stray cat that sometimes prowled their porch was absent. The stillness wasn't heavy like it had been in the past. It felt open now, like a blank page. Inside, the house carried the soft sounds of a new morning. The creak of floorboards under light footsteps, the slow hum of the kettle, a muffled yawn from Maddie's room. Leah had taken to rising early, sometimes before Maddie, to set out the cereal and pour milk into a small jug. She didn't say why, and Ethan didn't ask. Some acts didn't need explaining. After breakfast, Maddie slipped outside with a paper plate in her hands. Ethan watched from the porch as she crouched on the top step, setting the plate down just beyond the welcome mat. Steam rose faintly from the scrambled eggs she'd saved, and a few shreds of chicken sat on the side. She leaned back on her heels and waited. It didn't take long. The gray-striped cat padded in from the alley, tail flicking warily, nose twitching. It approached in short, cautious steps, pausing between each to glance at Maddie. She didn't move except to rest her hands in her lap. Leah appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of cocoa. She watched the scene in silence, her eyes soft. For a moment, Ethan caught the faintest smile on her face, small but real. The cat ate quickly, as though it didn't trust the quiet, then darted away into the yard. Maddie didn't seem disappointed. She simply picked up the empty plate, brushed off a few crumbs, and carried it inside. That afternoon, Ethan worked on the porch steps. The wood had gone soft at the edges, and each time someone came or went, it gave a little under their weight. He replaced one board at a time, measuring twice before cutting, running his hand over each surface until it felt right. Maddie handed him the screws without needing to be told. Leah held the level against the railing, watching the bubble with a seriousness that made him smile. When the last board was in place, they stood together at the edge of the porch. From there, they could see the yard stretching out, the fence line where the snow lingered, the street curving toward the heart of town. Across the road, Mrs. Carver from 2 houses down was planting early tulips, her gloves dark with soil. She raised a hand in greeting. Ethan returned it, realizing it was the first time in a long while he'd waved to a neighbor without feeling like a stranger. Inside the house, a small wooden sign hung just beside the door. It had been a gift from Officer Blake, carved in a simple block script, "Warren home." He'd left it on the porch one evening with no note. Ethan had mounted it himself, not because he cared about naming the place, but because it felt like staking a quiet claim, not on the property, but on the life inside it. Toward evening, clouds gathered low, promising rain. The girls sat at the kitchen table, drawing in the fading light. Maddie's sketch showed the porch with its new boards, the cat curled on the step. Leah's was of the oak tree out front, the branches tangled and bare but steady. Ethan stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, looking at them. There was no grand moment, no cinematic swell, just the awareness that the air in the house no longer carried the weight it once did. Later, after dinner, the three of them stepped out onto the porch to watch the rain come in. The first drops were cool on their faces, and the smell of wet earth rose from the yard. Maddie leaned against him. Leah stood on his other side, close enough that their shoulders touched. They stayed there until the rain turned steady, the sound of it on the porch roof a kind of music. Ethan glanced at the Warren home sign, the letters catching the porch light. For the first time in years, he didn't think about leaving. In the end, there were no parades, no headlines, no moment when the world seemed to stop and applaud. Just a porch with new boards underfoot, the smell of rain in the air, and two girls who no longer looked over their shoulders when they laughed. Ethan knew that healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in the quiet. Over breakfast, no one rushed through, in the way the cat began to linger a little longer on the step, in the comfort of knowing that home was more than walls and a roof. Maybe you've had a place, or a person, you thought you'd lost forever, only to find them again, in some unexpected form. If you have, tell me. Not for the story's sake, but so someone reading your words might remember that even the smallest returns can change the course of a life.